Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Lenkart. I'm the manager of the Slavic Cooking Service here at the University of Illinois. And today we're hosting this discussion. And the title of that discussion is Shadows of War, Russia-Ukraine Crisis, a panel discussion. And this is the second time we're hosting such a discussion. Last time we did it was in 2017, and we had our panel title might be a bit dramatic, but that panel discussion was Searching for Putin, an exploration of sources and perspectives. And we hope to continue in that along those same lines. This is an exploration of perspectives and sources as well. And unfortunately, due to time constraints, we cannot highlight or showcase all of the perspectives of this conflict, which there are many. So we're going to get started. And I think many of you, since 2014, have been following this conflict. We have guests and participants from all over the world, and we have about 67 in the room. And since 2014, we have seen many things. But what is real is the toll this conflict has taken, and we must remember the toll it has taken in these discussions. We are well insulated in a Zoom room, but there are casualties, of course, and the pain it brings. So we have more than 14,000 dead, an estimated 1 to 2 million internally displaced individuals due to this conflict, and of course there is this potential conflict that everyone is wary about. Most importantly, the individuals, the children, the families, the citizens of the countries that we are discussing right now. So we have a fantastic panel today, and I'm delighted to welcome all of them. Because of the time, I'm just going to do very brief introductions. And I think if you search every one of our scholars, you will see they are world-renowned, and they have amazing and many contributions, scholarly contributions that you can look into. We're going to be providing a bibliography of some of their publications, so that as a follow-up, when we send the recording, you get to see them. So our first panelist is Dr. Roman Ivashkiv. He is a faculty member at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and he's the language program coordinator. And our next panelist is Dr. Kristian Åtland from the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. And this is the preeminent institution that is responsible for defense-related research. And I would like to welcome Kristian and add this note. It is very late in Norway, and Kristian is joining us. And I'm so grateful to Kristian for joining us. And of course, Kristian will be followed by Dr. Dina Spechler from Indiana University of Bloomington, and she's a faculty member in the Department of Political Science. Once upon a time, I used to roam in those halls there. So welcome, Professor Spechler. And then afterwards, we have Dr. Paul Stronski, a research fellow, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and his analysis, he's widely known in the policy research circles, both in Washington, D.C., and also research related to Russia. So I welcome Dr. Stronski. And then, of course, our last panelist is David Satter. David is a journalist, and you probably recognize David's name with many publications over the years. And I think most famously, he was expelled from Russia for reporting on not only the contemporary Russian political scene, but also the establishment of the Putin administration there. So, and so I would like to welcome all of them. And so we're going to get started with Dr. Ivashkiv.
Thank you very much, Joe. Hi, everybody. I would like to thank Joe for organizing this event. I'm very honored to be part of this panel. And I think that Joe invited me to participate in the panel because the organizers probably felt that it was important to have a Ukrainian voice among the experts. So today I have two perspectives for you. As someone who was born in Ukraine and who still has family there, I would like to share some personal perspective. And then as somebody who teaches Ukrainian culture at the U of I, I'll share some thoughts on the situation. But just for the record, these are my personal thoughts. They do not reflect the position of my department or my university. So I'm speaking as a private individual here. And I'll start with a personal human perspective, and the moods and the messages that I'm getting from family and people I know in Ukraine and I'm in touch with are somewhat mixed. So on the one hand, I feel and see greater resolve this time, greater than in 2014 when the situation was a little bit more chaotic. And I see faith among Ukrainians in being better prepared this time, especially to fight on the ground, even though there are still some really serious concerns about the military capacity in the air. On the other hand, when I speak to relatives who are in far western Ukraine, not immediately close to the front line, I unfortunately sense some denial. People kind of carry on with their lives, and some of them tell me, no, we don't watch the news. And they kind of think and hope that the worst would not happen, that, you know, they say it's impossible, that the full-scale invasion is imminent. And they've been living with this since 2014, honestly, and some are in denial. And also very important, in light of the most recent developments where there's been some miscommunication between the Ukrainian government and some Western governments, most Ukrainians that I've spoken with and I'm in touch with are extremely grateful to friends and allies around the world who have supported Ukraine with equipment, supplies, defensive weapons, and so on. So I primarily have in mind the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, many other countries who have been helping very recently with shipments of equipment. As most people here today, I personally feel terrible about Ukraine's plight, and not only because I'm worried for the country's fate, political fate, I mean, but primarily because of the human sacrifice. Fortunately or unfortunately, I personally cannot go back to Ukraine and fight in that war, but knowing that many Ukrainians, young and old, who are less privileged than I am, are dying on the daily basis is just emotionally devastating for me. For the record, and I think Joe has just mentioned that number, the total number of casualties since 2014, as of today, is around 14,000 people and counting. So there's news of 1 or 2 people dead almost every day, dead or severely injured. As an academic, however, somebody who teaches Ukrainian culture on campus, I primarily see my contribution in educating the general public about the situation, making sure that as many people as possible are aware of what's going on in Ukraine and are not affected by, or at least remain somewhat invulnerable to Russia's most powerful weapon, which is disinformation and propaganda. I understand that with this audience, I kind of may be preaching to the converted, but here's my main message. All these narratives about the threat from NATO or protection of the Russian-speaking population in other countries, or Russia needing security assurances from the West are merely gaslighting and manipulation. It is not about NATO. Since its inception in 1949, NATO hasn't invaded or attacked neighbors. It is not about protecting Russian speakers. The only thing that Mr. Putin is threatened by is successful democratic Ukraine. We saw this in 2004 when the Democratic candidate Viktor Yushchenko ran for president and then was poisoned. And when he miraculously survived and won that election, Moscow started cutting off gas supply. And we also saw this in 2014, except at this time, Mr. Putin started war on Ukraine, presenting it as an internal conflict, some kind of a civil war, which it is obviously not. So his real fear is that the former Soviet republics, which today are independent sovereign states, are finally becoming democratic. That is, they gradually manage to run free and fair elections, they build civil societies, and slowly eradicate Soviet inherited corruption, which of course is taking longer than it should. In other words, Putin's Russia cannot come to terms with the fact that these republics like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, among others, have their own identities, national languages, and values. Putin desperately tries to restore the Soviet Union, even though nobody in their right mind wants back to the USSR in any shape or form. Mr. Putin has remained in power for 21 years, and he cannot accept Ukraine's independence and its success, albeit slow, in building a democratic society, because sooner or later, the democratization process will also start in Russia, and that will be the end of his regime. It is important that more people know and remember that Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of eastern Ukrainian Donbass is not the first time Mr. Putin has blatantly violated international law with impunity. In the early 1990s, Russia created a frozen conflict in Moldovan Transnistria, where it's still unresolved. Russia remains involved in Nagorno-Karabakh, the dispute between Azerbaijan and Armenia. They pose themselves as peacekeepers there. In 2008, Russia annexed parts of Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. And back then, the response from Western democracies was not very firm, as they continued not only to appease Russia, but to trade with it and to rely heavily on its natural resources, primarily oil and gas. So despite the imposed economic sanctions, which may only have been effective in the very long run, and may in fact bring graver consequences for the Russian population than for Mr. Putin and his close circle, Mr. Putin remained emboldened. And just to be clear, it would be much more effective to have targeted personal sanctions against those corrupt Russian politicians who always complain about the West, but nonetheless send their children to school in Western countries and possess tremendous assets there. Just to give you one example, Mr. Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, who is extremely critical of everything Western and oftentimes expresses his indignation about the West. Well, his daughter is educated at Columbia. So finally, I'd like to comment briefly on how Russia's aggression is reported in the news. Even the most credible sources, like the BBC, for example, often present Mr. Putin as this genius military commander and strategist, almost a Napoleon kind of figure, almost a chess player who outsmarts everybody. Oh, what is he going to do now? How is he going to surprise us again? We're all helpless. He'll inevitably gain the upper hand. The reality is, however, that holding a gun to someone's head and blackmailing the world isn't such a genius move after all. A much stronger move would be to finally fix Russia's economy and to eliminate poverty there. And so the general public deserves to know this broader context about Putin's regime, specifically the repeated murders and poisonings of opposition leaders and journalists in Russia. I'd like to end on a more positive note, though, and once again, thank everybody who supports Ukraine in whatever capacity they can. Establishing historical justice and truth is surely not easy, but I want to hope not impossible either. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ivashkiv. Now we're going to turn this over to Dr. Kristian Åtland.
Thank you. Good evening from Oslo. Can you hear me in Urbana? Thank you so much, Joe, for organizing this event and for inviting me to share a few thoughts on the topic of Russia-Ukraine relations, which is currently at the center of political and academic debates in Europe as well as in the US. I will try to keep my remarks brief and to the point, and I've tried to structure my thoughts around 4 questions that I think are important in trying to understand the dynamics at play in the Russia-Ukraine relationship. First, what is happening on the Russia-Ukraine border? Second, why is this happening now? And third, how should we categorize the more than 7-year-long conflict in Donbass? Is it a civil war or a foreign occupation? And fourth, why have the Minsk ceasefire agreements signed in 2014 and 2015 not been implemented? My well-informed co-panelists will probably also address some of these questions, particularly the first two ones. So I will allow myself to go into somewhat greater detail on the last two questions, dealing with the war in Donbass and the still unimplemented status of the Minsk agreement, or agreement rather. But let's start with the current situation on the border between Russia and Ukraine. What we have seen in the past few months is a substantial, some would say spectacular, buildup of troops and military hardware on the Russian side of the border, and a significant movement of Russian troops into neighboring Belarus, allegedly for the purpose of military exercises. Russia has also strengthened its military presence in Crimea and ramped up its arms and ammo supplies to the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, abbreviated DNR and LNR. All of this has, for obvious reasons, given rise to concerns that Russia may be preparing a new and potentially large-scale military incursion into Ukraine. Russia's military preparations have been accompanied by a series of political demands directed not only at Ukraine, but also at the West, NATO, and the US. And these demands have been put forth in the form of ultimatums. In short, Russia demands a formal halt to NATO's eastern enlargement, a permanent freeze on further expansion of the alliance's military infrastructure in the former Soviet territory, an end to Western military assistance to Ukraine, and a ban on intermediate range missiles in Europe. And this brings us to the second question: why is this happening now? After all, Ukrainian NATO membership is not something that is going to happen tomorrow or anytime soon. So why the urgency? On the Russian side, the buildup is being portrayed as a defensive Russian response to alleged threats from Ukraine and the West. It is being argued that Ukraine intends to retake Donbass and Crimea, and that NATO may assist the country in such an endeavor. In my view, such claims lack any credible evidence. Of course, Ukraine is eager to restore control of its pre-2014 territory and international borders, but the country has currently no plans to retake Donbass and or Crimea by military force. Instead, Ukraine pins its hopes on the long-term effects of the international political pressure on Russia, economic sanctions, diplomacy, negotiations, and proceedings in international courts. As for other factors that may explain the timing of Russia's military buildup and political ultimatums, I would just mention a few. First, in June last year, Ukraine gained status as a so-called enhanced opportunities partner with NATO, a status that it now shares with 5 other countries: Sweden, Finland, Georgia, Jordan, and Australia. Second, in October last year, it became clear, not least from various articles in Russian newspapers, that Russia had given up on President Zelensky and the prospects of meaningful political dialogue with Ukraine. Third, the arrest and prosecution of the Kremlin-friendly Ukrainian oligarch and lawmaker Viktor Medvedchuk, also in October, was seen by many as a sign of a tougher stance on the part of the Zelensky administration. Medvedchuk was accused of colluding with senior officials to finance separatist forces in the Donbass. Fourth, in the end of October, the armed forces of Ukraine demonstrated that they had acquired a new and potentially lethal capability, namely Turkish-made TB2 drones. And this weapon was used for the first time to take out a howitzer controlled by the Russia-backed separatist forces, which had been firing across the line of contact. And this incident and the Turkish arms sales to Ukraine were not well received in Moscow. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, there has been a growing Russian frustration related to the Zelensky administration's alleged lack of commitment to the Minsk process. That is the implementation of the ceasefire agreements that were negotiated in Minsk in 2014 and 2015. So let us now turn to the conflict in Donbass. What kind of a conflict is this? Is it a civil war? Is it a foreign, that is Russian occupation, or perhaps a combination of the two types of conflict? It should be emphasized here that the civil war one's use of the civil war label does not necessarily exclude the invasion label if one concludes that the Donbass conflict is both a Ukrainian civil war and a Russian invasion. One needs to consider which one of these two dimensions is the primary and whether the character of the conflict has changed over time. The official Russian position is that the Donbass conflict is and has been an internal conflict between the central authorities in Kiev and the self-proclaimed People's Republics of DNR and LNR. Ukrainian authorities, for their part, have on numerous occasions rejected the Russian attempts to frame the Donbass conflict as an intra-state conflict, claiming that Russia's role in it is both central and undeniable. For instance, at the 2016 Munich Security Conference, then President Petro Poroshenko took issue with Moscow's civil war rhetoric. Mr. Putin, he said, there is no civil war in Ukraine. That is your aggression. My take on this is that the interstate dimension of the Donbass conflict is not the secondary issue, but rather one of its defining features. Without Russia's financial, organizational, and military support, it is highly doubtful that the Donbass militants would have been able to sustain the insurgency over time and to seize and expand and retain control over significant parts of Ukraine's easternmost territory. And from the very beginning of the conflict, Donbass was heavily penetrated by Russian allies, agents, and operatives who were either supporting or directly controlling the insurgents. And Ukraine's eastern border became a frequently used crossing point for Russian arms supplies, Russian paramilitaries, and Russian regular troops. Finally, a few words about the Minsk process. Since the spring of 2014, numerous efforts have been made to establish a viable ceasefire and the process towards political normalization. Following the signing in September 2014 of a ceasefire agreement known as the Minsk Protocol, the level of violence gradually subsided, but only temporarily. And in January 2015, heavy clashes followed. The Russia-backed forces embarked on a new offensive, and the number of casualties surged. And again, the parties were brought to the negotiating table in Minsk, and the summit in February 2015 culminated in the signing of a new package of measures aimed at revitalizing the first Minsk Protocol. Today, 7 years after the signing of the second Minsk agreement, it can be noted that none of the 13 measures listed in the agreement has been fully implemented, and only a few of them have been partly implemented. According to the monitoring mission of the OSCE, there have been more than 1 million ceasefire violations in the Donbass since February 2015. Local elections under Ukrainian law are yet to be held in the occupied areas, and more than 250 miles of Ukraine's eastern border is still controlled by heavily armed Russian/separatist forces. When it comes to the underlying causes of the parties' failure to implement the Minsk agreements, the available sources allow for different interpretations. I will argue that the unimplemented status of the Minsk agreements to a significant degree can be attributed to the agreement's design and their vague and ambiguous language. The negotiations in Minsk were complicated by Ukraine and Russia's widely diverging views of the conflict's nature and causes, and who should or should not be present at the table as parties. And in their search for common ground, the parties decided to opt for somewhat loose formulations that allowed for more than one interpretations. The Ukrainians would, for instance, say that the agreed upon withdrawal of, quote, all foreign armed formations, military equipment, as well as mercenaries, this was Article 10 of Minsk II, can and should be interpreted as a reference to Russian regular troops and paramilitaries on Ukrainian soil. The Russians, for their part, would take this as take this phrase as a reference to Ukrainian government forces and volunteers. So the vagueness and ambiguity of the agreements did not make the implementation easy. Another major obstacle has been the problem of how to sequence the various measures listed in the agreements. And this is the essence of what I have called the sequencing trap. And simply put, Russia's preferred roadmap to peace would start with political measures, such as the holding of local elections on DNR/LNR terms, validated by Kiev, and the adoption of a special status law enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution. And without full implementation of these measures, the military provisions may, in Russia's view, not be implemented. And conversely, the Ukrainian side would like to see a full implementation of the agreement's military provisions, ceasefire, withdrawal of forces, exchange of prisoners, restoration of Ukrainian border control, etc., before implementation of the political measures. And Kiev's argument has been that it is near impossible to conduct OSCE observable local elections in the separatist-held regions without a functioning ceasefire and a situation where Ukraine's eastern border is controlled by Russian/separatist forces. So where does all of this leave us? Obviously, the 7-year anniversary of Minsk II gives a little reason for celebration. Despite significant international pressure, there has been little or no progress on the underlying political issues. Whether or not the Minsk process can be revitalized in the future, for instance, in the form of a Minsk III, is still an open question. Given the still unimplemented status of Minsk I and Minsk II, a follow-up agreement based on the same formula is likely to suffer the same fate as its predecessors. It is also an open question whether the recent resumption of talks, high-level talks in the Normandy format, that is between the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France, will succeed in bringing the peace process forward. A significant zone of possible agreement between Russia and Ukraine is, in my view, unlikely to open up in the near to medium-term future, as the parties seem to have fundamentally different views of what a peace settlement should look like. On that somewhat pessimistic note, I end my presentation and hand it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Åtland, for those insightful remarks. And we're going to now turn it over to Dr. Dina Spechler from Indiana University.
She needs to unmute herself.
You're still muted. My apologies. Yeah, there you go. There you go.
So I've been asked to speak about Russia's policies toward its neighbors in general and the relationship between those policies and understanding the current sources of conflict with Ukraine. In so doing, I'm going to try to present what I think is a Russian point of view. It's not necessarily that I agree with or want to defend it, but I also think that it's more than propaganda. And one, in order to understand Russia's actions, one needs to understand Russia's view of the situation. And I think one needs to take a step back from the current day and a little bit of perspective in the Putin era, which of course began in the year 2000 when he became president. Putin gave clarity, coherence, and direction to what had been a set of diverse, often conflicting impulses and actions with regard to Russia's approach to its neighbors that had occurred under President Boris Yeltsin. And I would also say, by way of introduction, that while Putin does definitely seem to be influenced by a number of key advisors, it's very important to emphasize that ultimately he's the responsible person here and he makes decisions as he sees fit. So for over 2 decades, Putin has had, I believe, 4 central occupations or preoccupations with regard to relations with its neighbors. The central preoccupation overall has been to undo the damage to Russia resulting from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. So within that, 4 specific objectives. First of all, to restore Russia's status as a great power that's recognized and respected by other great powers and by the international community as a whole. Secondly, to restore a clearly defined and universally recognized privileged sphere of influence, as Putin puts it, that includes all of the post-Soviet state, or what some Russians call their near abroad. Thirdly, to enhance the power and stability of the Russian state, both at home and abroad, and prevent developments in Russia's neighborhood from threatening either one. And fourthly, to keep at bay a Western alliance, which was formed to contain Russian power and which has always constituted, in Russian eyes, a threat to Russian security. So Putin's policies toward Russia's neighbors have evolved over the course of 2 decades while he's been in power, and they've been shaped by his perceptions of events taking place both inside Russia, in Russia's neighborhood, and just beyond that neighborhood. And these perceptions and the events that gave rise to them are critical to understanding, I believe, recent developments in the conflict with Ukraine. There have been 4 key moments, really, in this evolution of events and perceptions. 2 of them directly involving Ukraine, and all 4 of them involving NATO. So first of all, in March 1999, a year before Putin became president, was the admission of 3 former members of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, to NATO. Putin doesn't seem to have been focusing on foreign policy a whole lot at that time. He had very pressing domestic priorities, especially domestic terrorism perpetrated by Chechen Islamists and the war in Chechnya to suppress them. But by 2002, Putin was becoming increasingly focused on foreign policy, especially on developments in Russia's neighborhood. As Putin was coming to see it, the expansion of the Atlantic Alliance had substantially enhanced its power vis-a-vis Russia, making renewal of Russia's great power status much more difficult. And more ominously, that expansion had brought the alliance uncomfortably close to Russia's neighborhood, to what Putin viewed as Russia's vital sphere of influence. So this move deprived Russia of the buffer that had been provided by the Warsaw Pact that had been critical in guaranteeing Russia's security since the end of World War II. But it also demonstrated in Putin's eyes the perfidy of Western governments, which, as Putin came to believe, had forsworn NATO's incorporation of Warsaw Pact states. As Putin saw it, there had been promises, many promises, not to place a NATO army beyond the borders of Germany. Putin has quoted NATO Secretary General at the time, Manfred Werner, to this effect. And in exchange, Russia has agreed to remove its troops from East Germany and accept NATO's incorporation of a unified German state. So in Putin's eyes, this treacherous behavior seemed to prove that despite numerous protestations to the contrary, NATO remained what it always had been, hostile to Russia and a threat to Russia's control over its neighborhood. Policy implication was that Russia has to make it clear that further expansion of NATO was simply unacceptable, and would have grave consequences for the future of East-West relations. Second key moment in the evolution of Putin's policies toward Russia's neighbors came in March 2004, almost exactly 4 years later, when three of Russia's closest neighbors, the three Baltic states, were admitted to NATO as well. And from Putin's point of view, this move represented brazen defiance of Russia's clearly articulated red lines. It was a direct challenge to the concept of Russia's privileged sphere of influence in its own neighborhood. Moreover, it brought the NATO alliance directly to Russia's borders, significantly enhancing the threat to Russian security. So, although Russia was notably stronger economically by 2004 than it had been when the Soviet Union disintegrated, Russia was still too weak militarily to do much in response. But Putin's fierce determination to halt, even reverse, NATO's expansionist program and exclude the West from Russia's privileged sphere began to take shape in his mind at this time. The third key moment came a few months later, and in the same year, between November 2004 and then January 2005. And those events occurred in Ukraine and became known as the Orange Revolution. During this process, widespread anger in Ukraine at the announced outcome of a manifestly fraudulent runoff election sparked mass protests and strikes throughout the country, and it brought the Ukrainian economy to a standstill for 2 weeks. When the government agreed to hold a runoff and the pro-Western candidate was announced the winner, Putin was allegedly astonished as well as horrified. Russia's control of its immediate neighborhood had been successfully challenged from within, and Putin attributed the outcome to Western intervention. Ukraine had always been the neighbor about which Putin was most concerned. Almost a third of Ukraine's population is Russian-speaking, with many in the country, at least initially, sorry to see it emerge as an independent entity. The Russian state, by some accounts, had its origins in what is today's Ukraine. Part of Ukraine had been incorporated into the Russian Empire ever since the 17th century, and most of it by the end of the 18th century. And as Putin saw it, Ukrainians and Russians were really a single people, and Ukraine's independence was artificial and therefore illegitimate. Its vast coal reserves supplied a great deal of Russian energy. Since the 1970s, Russia had been exporting gas, its chief export revenue source, through Ukrainian pipelines to Western Europe, and Russia's most important naval assets were and are based in Ukraine. So now, with a pro-Western government in charge, the threat loomed that Ukraine too was going to join the NATO alliance. Moreover, and here's where I agree with Dr. Ivashkiv, Ivashkiv, that the threat loomed that the success of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine would threaten the stability, even the survival of Putin's government. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine might well spark a similar process, a democratic revolution in Russia. And Putin at this time began to devote a great deal of his energies to reversing that revolution and installing a new pro-Russian government. The fourth key moment in the evolution of Russian policy toward its neighbors also involved Ukraine, and that moment is much more familiar to Americans today. We've talked about it already. Came in March of 2014. By then, Russia had succeeded in restoring a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. When that government heeded Russia's demands that it refused to sign an agreement with the EU for political association and free trade, mass protests again erupted and continued for more than 3 months. So for Putin, economic ties between Ukraine and the EU, while not as threatening as membership in NATO, was still an unacceptable infringement on Russia's privileged sphere, preventing economic integration of the post-Soviet space. In contrast with previous moments of crisis, Russia now had the ability to deploy forces to achieve what had been longstanding aims in Ukraine. A vote by the Ukrainian parliament to remove the pro-Russian leader led Russia to seize and annex Crimea, where its naval assets were located, send in troops, as we've said, to assist pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. And at that time, tens of thousands of Russian troops were stationed on the border with eastern Ukraine. Well, their number has waxed and waned since then, but they've been a constant presence, serving as a reminder that Russia could seize more Ukrainian territory anytime if it chose. So I also want to address the question of why now? And I think we've had a wonderful analysis here already of why now. But another factor, a couple of factors I think we should consider. I think it's important that this buildup that we are now seeing actually began in late March 2021, which was not long after President Joe Biden took office. So it's not clear to me exactly what motivated the buildup, although I think the persuasive case has been made for some developments in Ukraine. But the movement of thousands of Russian troops and heavy weapons from inside Russia as far away as Siberia might have reflected Russian concerns that the new American president might be more receptive to a renewed Ukrainian bid to join NATO than his predecessor had been. President Trump, if you recall, had been famously skeptical about the very existence of NATO, let alone any move to expand it. And overall, he was notably sympathetic to Russian concerns, eager to placate Putin and avoid offending him. And he viewed the supply of American weapons to Ukraine as leverage to induce Ukrainian cooperation with his efforts to discredit Biden and his son, not as an instrument of policy aimed at strengthening a fledgling democracy. So I believe that quite possibly Putin feared that Biden might be more receptive to Ukraine's plea for additional weapons and American trainers, and that the initial Russian troop buildup may have been intended as a deterrent to such assistance. Well, in fact, we all know it had the opposite effect. Biden authorized the Pentagon to announce a new $125 million aid package, military aid for Ukraine. President Zelensky was invited to visit the US in September of last year. And in advance of that visit, more $60 million in aid was promised. But Zelensky used that visit to press for rapid consideration of Ukraine's bid for NATO membership. And while Washington resisted his pleas, it sent US warships into the Black Sea in a gesture of support. And then in September 2021, NATO conducted joint military exercises with Ukrainian forces. So from Putin's point of view, American policy, I think, was obstructing the realization of his critical objective, the maintenance of a privileged sphere of influence in which Ukraine would play a central role. And with American backing, NATO's connection with Ukraine was intensifying, frustrating Putin's determination to keep the alliance at bay and maintain a robust buffer zone between its forces and those of Russia. So despite the fact that the US rejected Zelensky's pleas to support a speedier process for acceptance into NATO, Putin may well have believed that such a step would indeed be taken in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spechler. Now, we appreciate those perspectives. Now we're going to turn this over to Dr. Paul Stronski because time is of essence. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you all for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be in such a distinguished lineup. One of the things, I know David Satter's probably going to have this problem as well, but one of the things that happens when you go third or fourth is that a lot of what you had planned to say has been said. So I'm going to try to cut things down a little bit, and also, give a little bit of insight of what this, as somebody who has worked in government, I worked for both the Bush and Obama administrations, and as somebody who lives in Washington and has a lot of engagement both with Russians, our European colleagues, and allies to give some perspective of how this looks from the Washington viewpoint. And I also think we do have to highlight something that Dr. Spechler said, that this is happening also in a very politicized U.S. environment. And so we have former President Trump has been very negative just in the last few days about U.S. commitments to NATO, and that seems to be selling well with some of his base. And there's a whole discussion up on Congress about how much engagement we should be giving to Ukraine at this moment. So I think this is this is happening in a broader context that is not just Ukraine, Russia, Russia, U.S., but this is also highlighting some of the internal divisions we have both in the United States as well as both in the Western community. Now, I would argue that Vladimir Putin is really threatening a war right now in Europe, the likes that we haven't seen in decades. And while this is focused in on Ukraine, and I do want to highlight what my previous panelist said about this is the second time over the past year where we've had a massive military buildup to catch the world's attention. And I do know that this happened last spring, and Biden met with Putin late last spring, and that sort of de-escalated the conflict for a while. It seemed to have sort of put it on the back page, but there were some worrying signs over the last year, specifically vis-a-vis Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, for example, published a very long article, 700 words, which is a very long article, 7,000 words, which is a very long article for a head of state, in which he basically denied Ukraine's right to exist, and denied Ukrainian as a separate history, and denied Ukraine as a separate people. And I think this happened over the summer, and I think that also raised a lot of worry here in Washington, D.C., simply because, I think, the Biden administration did not really want to come in having to deal with Russia, Ukraine, because of all the baggage of the previous administration and the campaign. They wanted to tackle, COVID. They wanted to repair the transatlantic relations, and they wanted to sort of pivot again to China. But what this past year has shown is that you really, a sitting U.S. president, can't really ignore Russia, and that Russia can certainly bring itself to Washington, bring itself to Brussels' attention at a moment's notice. So while we've certainly seen sort of the sparks and the anger being focused on Ukraine over the past year, I would argue that this is more than just Ukraine at this point. And I think Dr. Spechler did a nice segue into this. Ukraine almost is the vehicle. He certainly wants control over Ukraine. Vladimir Putin does. He certainly wants to be able to dictate, how close Ukraine can engage with other partners. But he also wants sort of a greater say over the post-Cold War security order to remake it more towards his liking. And I think, you heard a few minutes ago about everything that he dislikes about it. I think, some of the Russian claims, as they're not always accurate, and there's a lot of disinformation going on about, who said what and what happened 10 years ago or 15 years ago, or who agreed to what in 1990. But clearly what Putin is now demanding, it's not just, the separatist regions in Ukraine. It's not just, that the world recognizes the annexation of Crimea, which very few do. He basically wants the United States and NATO to recognize a Russian sphere of influence. And that's a problem for policymakers here in Washington and policymakers here in NATO. And it is also a violation of the 1990 Charter of Paris, which the Soviets signed, that basically both sides agreed that, it was part of the OSCE, that every nation had a core principle of being able to make its own foreign policy choices, and they shouldn't be dictated by others. It does basically, he's also demanding that pretty much NATO remove all forces from NATO states that joined since that first round of expansion in the late 1990s. That's a non-starter for NATO because it violates NATO's pledge of equal security for all members, and it would leave out the frontline states, the Baltics and Poland. Now we can debate whether the Baltics and Poland and NATO expansion should have happened or not. but it happened, and so we're now stuck in this issue. Insists that NATO close the door to membership to Ukraine and Georgia as well, and any other pretty much former Soviet state. But I would agree. NATO membership is not really on. Ukraine is not on the path to NATO membership, and neither is Georgia. There's so many stumbling blocks and a lack of agreement within NATO itself on whether these countries are ready and whether we can defend them. So it's not really going to happen. But again, if we did that, it would violate both the NATO charter that we have as well as the violation of the Paris Charter of 1990. So that is also, a challenging issue. And he wants NATO not to deploy weapons that could threaten the Russian heartland. This is probably something we can talk about with the Russians. The Russians have violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, but we actually pulled out of it too. And then the final thing that they did is they, in these negotiations, they've kind of gone public. They've talked about them. They asked us to submit our answers in writing, which is kind of strange. And then they released just yesterday that writing, both the NATO response and the U.S. response. So I think there's been a lot of talk, and I think the first speaker talked about how strategic Putin has been, and how everybody here is saying he's got all the cards, that he's got a very good deck of cards to play with. But I also think, I wonder, he basically now has two options. I mean, he's brought this up to the brink, and he can either double down and start a war, which would be quite dangerous, or he could climb down and not get his demands met, which could also be quite humiliating. The U.S. is certainly, and NATO are certainly willing to engage. We're willing to talk about new security arrangements, new transparency agreements. Everybody's pretty much admitted that Ukraine and Georgia are not immediately going to get NATO membership anytime soon. But also, the sort of the continued threats, and also, demanding these things that he knows that the West cannot give, really makes this a very difficult situation. And I wonder, I'm not sure Putin, is Putin blind to the risks of war? The costs are heavy. I think he already knows some of those costs, but their costs are heavy in Ukrainian and Russian lives. If he does go in, the cost of occupying greater amounts of Ukraine and governing a vast territory, however far he might want to go, and also the ultimate rejection of a nation that is clearly not very positively inclined towards Russia anymore. So I think nobody really knows how this is going to end. We certainly don't in the United States. Putin might not even know himself. But I think in other parts of the world where Putin has used force, he's done so in a very constrained way. If you look how it has happened in Syria, if you looked how it happened in the first sort of iteration of this war, I think he, just like we in the United States, knows that proactive wars, whether that's Afghanistan or Iraq, don't always go as you plan it. I think Russia also has learned that in Afghanistan and Chechnya as well. So I think, for the U.S., the challenge lies in a few things. First of all, we need to think up what our options are. And I think that's very easy when it comes to if he goes for a full-throated, invasion and it's very bloody. We condemn it. We pose very damaging sanctions, but those sanctions will probably hit us as well. We provide support for Ukraine to resist in any ways it can, and that includes budgetary support. One of the things the Russians have done is really devastated the Ukrainian economy in the last year, and send deterrence and more troops to frontline NATO states. But I think the bigger challenge is what we do if it's less than a big massive invasion, something more hybrid. I think President Biden and sort of the NATO General Secretary have had a really tough time keeping the alliance united right now, because various different parts, the Eastern Europeans and the UK and the Americans, seem to be all on this is extremely serious situation. Some other Europeans are less, appear at least less concerned. But there's also, in addition to sort of the outright military aggression, there's, other ways, hybrid ways, the continued pressure on the economy, continued pressure to keep Ukraine economically or politically in turmoil, cyber threats. Those are all issues that we need to think about. And then I think we also need to prepare for what ways they might be able to hit us. If we hit them with sanctions, they're going to hit us some way probably too. And we don't know how that's going to pan out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stronski. I would like to bring next distinguished journalist, David Satter. David. David, you're muted.
I think I'm on. Is this better now? Can you hear me now?
Beautifully.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. And thanks to the members of the panel for their presentations. I have a somewhat different perspective on all of this, having lived for a long time in the former Soviet Union and in the Soviet Union itself, and have studied and experienced the psychology of this part of the world. A couple of things I'd like to point out right from the outset. First of all, what Putin, like any Russian leader, is not necessarily going to express his true views. People in the Soviet Union had quite a school in dissimulation. They were forced to say one thing, and of course, oftentimes they thought something that was completely different. This is reflected in the post-Soviet period. It's reflected in Russia in particular, and it's reflected in the statements of Vladimir Putin. If he says that he wants to restore the Soviet Union, or he wants to restore at least Russia's greatness, it doesn't mean that he actually wants to do that. It could mean that his motives are, in fact, quite different. The other thing that's important to bear in mind is that foreign policy for Russia, for post-Soviet Russia, is, and war in general, is an instrument of internal policy. And we have a long history of this. Russia embarks on wars in order to strengthen the hold on power of those who are in charge in Russia, not necessarily to achieve a specific foreign policy objective. The first war in Chechnya, which was, although a part of the Russian Federation at the time, was nonetheless identified by the Russian leaders as a foreign entity, and in fact had declared its independence from Russia, was undertaken, in the words of Oleg Lobov, who was then the head of the Security Council, because Russia needed a short, victorious war in order to boost the rating of Putin, not of Putin, but of Yeltsin, which at the time was very low. As we know, the war was neither short nor victorious. And apparently it didn't occur to anyone that that was not a very good reason to start a war. But that was the reality. The motivation was even more clear in the case of the Second Chechen War, which was made possible by the bombing of the apartment buildings in Moscow and other Russian cities in 1999, and which facilitated Putin's rise to power. The bombings, as you know, were blamed on the Chechens. They were used to justify a Second Chechen War. That war immediately transformed Putin into a non-entity and a stooge of Yeltsin, into a national hero who was avenging a cruel terrorist act carried out against the Russian people. And it successfully led to him being elected president. As we know, he has not surrendered power since. The war in Georgia was undertaken immediately after the refusal of NATO to extend preliminary membership status to NATO to Georgia and Ukraine at the Bucharest summit, and had an important effect in boosting the status of Dmitry Medvedev. And most important, the war in Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea and the invasion of Eastern Ukraine came as a response to the Euromaidan revolt, which raised the possibility that the Russian population would follow the Ukrainian example, or at least learn from it. In all cases, we have war undertaken to distract the population in Russia from their real interests and consolidate the population around the regime. Had that effect in the case of the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of East Ukraine. Now we have when the Russian military incursion in Ukraine encountered problems, the next step was again a military adventure, in this case, the war in Syria, which also had the effect of consolidating support for Putin. The regime that exists in Russia today, it doesn't need to be explained to anyone here, I think, is not a democratic regime. This is a regime in which a very small group of people monopolize power and property, and they hold on to power through corruption, misinformation, selective terror, including assassinations, terrorist acts which they themselves inspire, and falsification of elections. And under these circumstances, for a whole variety of reasons, the situation in Russia appears calm at the moment. But the Russian leaders are perfectly well aware that a system that's based on massive theft and on intimidation is by its nature inherently unstable. And this is why they are so hostile to the West, which would do anything to welcome them if they were able to abide by any kind of civilized norms. They are in the position of constantly seeking ways to consolidate their power. And one of the few ways that's available to them is through foreign aggression. What we're seeing now has had the effect inside Russia of once again consolidating the support of Russians for the regime. So even if Putin does nothing, various people in the United States have talked about saving Putin from a loss of face. In fact, that's his problem. He already has been victorious because he has demonstrated something which for Russians, unfortunately, is very important. He's demonstrated Russia's power and ability to intimidate. He's played on rather atavistic instincts in the population, which including the unwillingness to consider the rights and identity of people who once were part of the Soviet Union. And at least for the moment, has solidified his hold on power. We don't know, for sure what his intentions are. However, whatever he does, he has created instability, he has created uncertainty, and he's applied pressure to Ukraine and attempted to change the situation in Ukraine independent of the interests of the people who live there. Under these circumstances, I think that we should be very circumspect about giving credit to what Putin says are his intentions. And the Russian officials and Russian representatives abroad love to propagate the idea that that Putin thinks in terms of 19th century power politics, spheres of influence, and so on. The term spheres of influence is, of course, hopelessly confused when we discuss what's happening in Russia, because sphere of influence doesn't mean the domination of a country. You can influence, we have a sphere of influence, but we don't dominate or determine the political outcomes, for example, in Great Britain or France. Similarly, sphere of influence is a voluntary phenomenon, whereas outright domination is not voluntary. So if we say that Russia is seeking a sphere of influence, we're using words inaccurately. Russia is not seeking a sphere of influence. A sphere of influence is won through influence. What Russia is seeking is domination and control. And if we discuss the attempt to dominate foreign countries as if we're talking about a legitimate aspiration to a sphere of influence, we're in the end misleading ourselves. Is Russia willing to take the risks that are involved in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Well, if we look at their previous actions, we see that they only attacked opponents that they considered to be weak. They made a very big mistake in the first Chechen war, but that was not because they were willing to take a particular risk. Pavel Grachev, who was the defense minister at the time, said that he could settle the situation in Chechnya, and particularly in the city of Grozny, which was the capital, with one parachute regiment in 2 hours. Well, of course, the war went on for considerably more than 2 hours. The bombing of the buildings, which all evidence shows was carried out by Russian security. There's no evidence to this day that implicates the Chechens in those bombings. Was a risk inside the country, the risk that they would be found out. But they're brazen, and the war on Chechnya that resulted was a war that they knew they could win. They were ready to use weapons weapons that are banned by international conventions. And after a 3-year hiatus between the first war and the second war, they were well prepared to move into a territory with the population of only 1 million people and commit whatever atrocities were necessary in order to take it over. Similarly, in the case of Ukraine, Ukraine in 2013, 2014 had 6,000 battle-ready troops. They have considerably more now. So needless to say that Crimea was the base for large numbers of Russian forces. They didn't have to go anywhere in order to take it over. So with that history of attacking weak opponents and attacking them for internal political reasons, are we likely to see an invasion of Ukraine? I'm very skeptical that we are. For one thing, Ukraine is no longer weak. It is true that they can be overwhelmed by a massive Russian invasion, particularly one that makes full use of the Russian Air Force. But invading is one thing. Occupying successfully is something else. The areas that now are included in the separatist enclaves, those were the most pro-Russian parts of Ukraine, always, and up until the invasion. The areas that Russia would invade now are pro-Ukrainian and are very fertile ground for partisan warfare. So, of course, we can't read the minds of the Russian leaders, and certainly they will not be deterred by the prospect of mass casualties if they consider it's in their interest. But a war against the Ukrainians, who would be highly motivated, waged by Russian troops who would not be motivated, in a culture in which people are accustomed to thinking of Ukrainians as a related people, could become very unpopular very fast, and could finally pose a threat again, a threat of destabilization in Russia itself. And since the whole purpose of Russian foreign policy is to consolidate this kleptocratic rule in Russia, it would seem to me to be counterproductive for them to launch such a war. It's counterproductive for the West to engage them on what are ridiculous demands that, I mean, and it constitutes, in effect, a request, a demand that Russia make foreign policy for the United States and for NATO. And on the contrary, it seems to me that the proper approach is simply to take maximum steps to build up Ukraine's defenses, under which circumstances I believe that even Putin's attempts at intimidation can be neutralized. And what is now an impressive concentration of forces can be reduced to a kind of sound and light show. Of course, only further events will show. But if, in fact, Russia follows the pattern that it has become very clear ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, of attacking only weak opponents and doing so in order to consolidate power in Moscow itself, then an invasion of Ukraine doesn't make sense. Threatening an invasion makes perfect sense because it consolidates people around inside Russia around the regime. It elevates Russia to a position of seeming importance in the eyes of a lot of people, forces people to pay attention to Russia and its so-called concerns. But threatening is one thing. Carrying out an invasion is something else. I think there's reason to hope that, in fact, this will not go beyond the stage of threats. And I think under any circumstances, it would be extremely unwise and counterproductive for the US to try to engage in any kind of dialogue with Russia over obviously absurd and illegal demands.
Thank you very much, David. Those are really good thoughts. And now I think everyone has been waiting patiently to ask questions. Dear participants, what we recommend is go ahead and grab the mic, unmute yourself to ask a question. If you prefer, you can type in the question and we will just read it out loud. But this is an opportunity for you to ask a question. So we have about 15 minutes or so. We're opening up for questions. So feel free to ask a question. Thank you. And if you could introduce yourself so that and address the question to the person you're wanting the response from. Go ahead, Dr. Dominicis.
Hi, thank you very much for the very thought-provoking presentations in a very brief periods of time. My question is to Dr. Spechler. Dr. Spechler, what do you think we can learn, if anything, about comparing the strategy of Belgrade under Milosevic towards the former Yugoslav republics with large Serbian minority populations within them, and the behavior of Serbia over the last 30 years to gaining insight as to what kind of political strategic recommendations the rest of the world should have in terms of dealing with Putin's behavior Moscow's behavior towards Ukraine and the other Soviet republics that have Russophone or Russophile concentration populations on the border with the Russian former republic of the former Soviet Union. Thank you.
I'm not sure I really understand the question, what we can learn from this, from developments in the Balkans with regard to what Russia is doing or what we should do with regard to Russia.
Yes, I guess the question is about irredentism and nationalism. I mean, and public opinion. I mean, how much, I mean, the point has been made, of course, that, if it wasn't Milosevic, it would have been somebody else would have emerged to make the same demands or similar demands that Belgrade made on Croatia and Bosnia and holding on to Kosovo. Because basically it's a statement about nationalism and Serbian nationalism and levels of analysis question. I mean, it focused on Putin, like he doesn't have public opinion constraints on him from Russian nationalism and nationalists within Russia. I do see some reporting pointing out that he's in the center. There's much more radical people around him that represent constituencies within Russia, and he attempts to balance these forces, these political demands. What do you think about that reporting and that role of nationalism as a constraining factor, limiting any political decision latitude by a Russian so-called leader? Thank you.
Okay, well, I have a different take on Milosevic. I don't think that a Milosevic was inevitable. I think Milosevic was determined to exploit nationalism, Serbian nationalism, for his own benefit. I don't think that in the absence of Milosevic, there would inevitably have been a Milosevic who would have been as genocidal in his policies as Milosevic. Milosevic was very distinctively ready to drum up to exploit nationalism, which had actually diminished and subsided during the Yugoslav era, and he made a very conscious attempt to rise to power on the strength of evoking and arousing Serbian nationalism. So I don't think that was a foregone conclusion. So having said that, to go to what I think is your real question, which is not about Milosevic, but about Russian nationalism and whether Putin is being driven by an upsurge of nationalism in Russia. Or possibly your question might be, is Putin similarly taking advantage of the existence of Russian nationalist sentiments in Russia for his own purposes? So I think more the second than the first. In other words, Russian nationalism is not that widespread or a view that's not that widely held, either as far as we know among ordinary Russians or among Russian elites, that Putin simply has to bow to it. Although I do believe that Putin wants and needs the support of Russian nationalism. They're Russian nationalists, they are useful to Putin, but I don't think that this is driving Putin's policy. But would it help to enable Putin to take any particular actions in Ukraine? Well, there I actually agree with very much with the analysis that we've just had from Mr. Sauter, that I don't think that in the end Putin would retain the support of the Russian population, nationalists or otherwise, were he to get bogged down, as he inevitably would be, were he to go to anything more than a small seizure of territory in the East. I think that would really redound to his disadvantage, and I don't think Russian nationalism would assist him. So again, I don't think Russian nationalism would play out the same way in terms of domestic politics in Russia the way Serbian nationalism played out in Serbia.
We have a couple of chat questions. Catherine and Olga, can you read some of them for us?
So our next question, I think, would be for any of the panelists, but this one's from Marilyn Young. And she's asking, is Putin distracting us or the Russian people from the spread of COVID?
It could be to any of our panelists, if you're able to pick that question up.
I could try to take it. It's Paul. I'm not sure that he is. What I think this is showing is that Putin can walk and chew gum at the same time. Russia is one of the hardest hit countries from the COVID pandemic, and they've particularly right now in late winter or December, January, February. And we've seen a very active Putin on the foreign policy stage at the same time, both with his intervention in Kazakhstan and in this military buildup. So I think he's sort of showing that he can, Russia might have a bad economy, it might have all these other problems, but he can still manage all of this. So I don't think it's so much distraction as showing he can do a whole lot at the same time.
Great. Well, thank you for that. So we have another question here from Martin Spechler, and he's asking, why doesn't NATO agree that Ukraine will not be joining the alliance in the near future? That seems to be the reality at this time, and such promises can be revoked. So I think this again is for any of our panelists.
I'm ready to answer that, but maybe one of my colleagues here would like to. So I think there's a matter of principle at stake, that it's very important for NATO to uphold the idea that was actually articulated in previous agreements, particularly in 1990 in Europe, that and it's very important to the nature and future of Europe today, that states have the right to determine their own foreign policies, and that if this is the direction that Ukraine is going in, then Ukraine could conceivably, theoretically do that. I think assurances are being given to Russia that nothing is going to happen quickly in that regard. And I don't think there's been enough controversy over revoked promises. I don't think it would be wise to make a promise, and as the Russians are now insisting, a promise on paper, to avoid the situation that emerged in the 1990s, to make a promise and then revoke it. So I don't think NATO wants to support the idea that any state can have a veto power over the foreign policies of other states, or that NATO should bow to such a principle.
It looks like Kristian would like to come in here for a moment.
Yes, I would agree with what Professor Spechler just said. This is a difficult issue. It was dealt with all the way back in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, when NATO stated that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of the alliance. Without putting a time frame on that, obviously at the time, neither Ukraine nor Georgia got a so-called membership action plan, still hasn't got a membership action plan. So this is not something that's going to happen anytime soon, but NATO is not willing to go back on what it said in 2008. Obviously, as Professor Spechler said, NATO is not willing to give Russia a veto right on this issue. But it has been discussed. It was suggested by Samuel Charap at RAND Corporation. So some probably read his op-ed a few weeks ago, when he suggested that NATO should just make an official statement that Ukrainian NATO membership is not going to happen soon, and he argued that that would, in essence, be a factually correct statement. But then we would run the risk of undermining some of the basic principles and values upon which the alliance and sort of the Western community is based on. And NATO, there's no consensus within NATO now that such a statement should be made. NATO's open door policy remains in force. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then it looks like a few people are asking about the recent protests in Belarus and instability there, and if you think that might have any relation to the current conflict with Ukraine.
Yeah. There may be a link in this sense that I think Belarus now feels far more obliged to support Russian policy initiatives. Belarus has always been hesitant to have a major Russian military force on its territory. Lukashenko has always wanted to preserve a modicum of independence, but his current situation or predicament is so weak in the wake of those protests. He's utterly dependent on Putin. And therefore willing to accede to the maneuvers in the north, which threaten Kiev. So I think we might not have seen as large a Russian military presence on Ukraine's northern borders had Lukashenko not been confronted with mass protests for which he desperately wanted Russian support.
Also, maybe I can add here that those protests once again reminded the Russian leadership of what could happen in Russia itself. And just as the protests, the situation, the levers of power in Russia are all controlled by the regime. The only way the regime that can be replaced is if there's a split in the ruling elite, or if there's a self-organizing mass protest that's simply too big to suppress. The Russians got a good look at that in Ukraine in 2013, and of course they're certainly aware of what happened in Belarus and also in Kazakhstan. All of this increases their desire to take actions that will consolidate the population around those in power. Joe, if I could, I'm going to have to leave soon. I wonder if there's anyone who has a question specifically for me. I'd be glad to answer it. Otherwise, I will have to wish everyone well and leave my participation. Is there anyone?
Yeah, I realize, especially for Kristian, it's very late at night in Oslo, and I know that a couple of your teaching engagements and stuff, so we completely understand. So what we could potentially do is, if it is okay with the panelists, if there are, further discussions or questions, we can have them, send the questions directly to you for follow-up. But we can take a couple more questions, and I think we have an information-related question. Maybe we could entertain that question. That's somewhat important. I think this is coming from M.A. Johnson. As there or will there be a targeted disruption in email, online, social media communication in Ukraine? Yes. Kind of an information war. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll say I think that the Russians have already shown that they're capable of information war, and not just in Ukraine. I mean, but I don't think it's necessarily tied to the existing situation. That's likely to happen. In fact, even if there's if this present situation doesn't lead to overt fighting. Because that's just the way in which the world is organized. Now, they didn't hesitate to interfere in the US, so why should they have any hesitation about trying to disrupt?
Absolutely, and cyber attacks in Ukraine have been continuous, and one of the more major ones happened just recently, maybe a week ago.
So in effect, that may not change.
I would add that the very fact that Putin, that Biden has already admitted the vast differences and divergence within NATO itself as to just how we would respond to what going on in Ukraine makes that sort of thing, any sort of cyber operation, much more tempting, because the likelihood of united NATO sanctions on Russia in response to any kind of cyber manipulation is far less certain than a major military incursion.
I think the other questions touch on, and this will be our last question. I know everyone has to run. Is the neighborhood, the regional dimension? Several of the countries were mentioned: Germany, of course, Belarus, and ethnic minorities within Ukraine. The dynamics there. Any thoughts on, especially Germany, its reaction to this conflict and war? I don't know if Kristian or Paul or anybody else wants to take that one.
Well, I can say the interesting thing about Germany is the deep division in the German government in terms of its own inclinations. On the one hand, you have social democrats who are longtime supporters of friendly relations and heavy energy dependence on Russia. And then you have the Greens, who are far less willing to and interested in accommodating Russia. And what we're seeing in terms of German, both silence, occasion, the visit to Ukraine, but also unwillingness to provide or even assist others in providing military assistance to Ukraine, reflects that deep division in the German government.
Yeah, and one of the comments was specifically tied to the recent visit by Prime Minister Orban to Moscow and the dimensions there. But looks like there's a lot more avenues that we could explore. But I think we better end it here, because I think several of us, I think specifically our panelists, are in other time zones other than the central US time zone. So, well, I really would like to thank all of the panelists for their generosity, their expertise, and their perspectives. And thank you very much for sharing this, your knowledge, your expertise with all of us. And so thank you very much. And thank you everybody for participating in this discussion. And I hope we can do it again. And so have a good evening, and we'll see you soon.